The first part of the risk assessment project requires you to provide a description of the organisation so that the examiner can build up a mental picture of what your organisation does. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things that I think would be a good idea to avoid. The first is try and avoid making this section sound too similar to the About Us section of the company's website. Whilst you are required to provide a description of the services offered and the products that are manufactured, don't forget to include information about the actual activities that are carried out in terms of the work tasks that most often get carried out in your workplace that are going to be featured in part 2, because part 2 is where you're going to be identifying hazards and identifying control measures. Well, part 1 is about setting out the scene for what's going to follow in part 2. So it needs to be very practical. It needs to describe in very practical terms for the examiner the tasks and activities that are carried out. The second thing is the use of jargon needs to be basically eliminated. Don't use any jargon, because the examiner may not be familiar with your industry and therefore won't be familiar with any jargon that's used within your industry. So once you've done the initial first draft, go over it and with a view to just checking yourself that you haven't inadvertently included any specific industry jargon. The other bit to part 1 of this risk assessment project is to provide a description of how you completed the risk assessment, i.e. the different methodologies you used to conduct the risk assessment. And that needs to include as a minimum the sources of information you consulted, who you spoke to, how the hazards and controls were identified. And it's important here that you can obviously demonstrate that you have done your research and that you've also involved people, because there's different ways of going about risk assessment. It could be physical, visual observation of tasks. It could be a reference to previous incidents that have happened and the investigation that might have arisen out of it. It could be that you consulted with experts. It could be that you have gone onto the HSE website and downloaded a relevant approved code of practice or health and safety guidance document. All this goes into this section and it appears in the report as part of the first section. But here's my advice: don't attempt to do this part of the assessment until the end. Leave it until the end, because at this point you don't know how you're going to conduct the risk assessment. It will save you a lot of time and potential frustration doing it that way than trying to anticipate how you're going to do the risk assessment, because circumstances might change and you might decide to take a different route with your risk assessment when it comes round to doing it. You might choose different hazards to base your risk assessment on, and you'll have to go back then to this part of the project to rewrite it. So yeah, just leave it until the end, and then you'll find it much easier to complete this part of the risk assessment project. I hope you've got some value out of the video that you've just seen. If so, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel so that you can be alerted to when we produce and upload more videos.